Yeah. So, hi everyone again, and welcome to our second online training program. So, what we are doing today is really discussing the idea of power, privilege, and oppression. And we have our guest speaker, Enzio, who Genevieve will introduce not so long from now. But before we do, I just want to speak to remember last week we spoke about the ideas around SOGI, which is sexual orientation and gender identity. And we looked at 5 artworks at the Javits Art Center which speak to this. And today we are looking at 2 artworks. And the reason why I chose 2 artworks this time is because I wanted to be a conversation with you. I wanted to be a dialogue with you, where we look at 2 artworks and you guys will have to actually speak to me about how this speaks to the conversations we're having today. Now remember, this is only like 5 to 6 minutes, so it's gonna have to be quick, which means you may not have to raise up your hand because I'm using my phone today. I may not see. Just there. Okay, I'm getting a call. Sorry. Okay. So I will now open to the work. I think I quickly spoke to this just now about from Jared Sikoto. Now this work is called Song of the Pig, and it was done in 1947. So if you don't know, Jared Sikoto was a full-time artist and was basically the most important South African artist during the late 20th century. So when you look at this work, knowing who Sikoto is, and of course, he always cuts into the heart of colonial and apartheid control in the South African society. So when you look at this work, let's see if I do this again. So when you look at this work, how do you think it speaks to the 4 ideas of what we're speaking to today? So we have power, privilege, and oppression.
Just feel free to comment, anyone.
Just unmute. And I mean, it doesn't have to be hectic. Like what, okay, let's start here. What do you see? And then later we'll discuss what does that mean. So what do we see in front of us? Guys,
Yeah, we seeing black men there.
we see black?
Yeah, we seeing black men working.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we see black men working. Are they all black men?
I think so.
Does everyone agree?
No, there's a white person standing there.
Okay, there's a white person standing there.
Yeah, is it?
Okay,
Yeah,
perfect.
I think I know the I know the picture of Carol Scott. It's the name of it.
Okay.
It's Song of the Pig. Ne?
Song of the Pig, Dad. That's the one.
Yeah. Yes. So yeah, I see black people working there, and there's a white guy there. As if like is the one who's informing them what to do and checking if they're working accordingly.
Oh,
Yeah.
nice. So there we have something. So we see, what do we see? We see a white guy. And what you're taking it as a step further, you're saying he's telling them what they need to do. Now remember that was done in 1947. How do you think this relates to South African history, particularly with regards to the conversations we're having today? Anyone can answer that. And Genevieve, I can't see my time, but you'll let me know when it's time.
I think it speaks to the subjects that we're touching on today because as artists, they were the voice of the people during the apartheid era, right? And and this is one of the works that he used this is one of the paintings that speaks to oppression, meaning that the white people were the ones giving the orders, and the black people were the one doing all the labor, working and getting paid close to nothing, right? And this is also speaking to privilege because white people, I've never seen a white people picking up a pick and digging down or in the streets doing the actual labor. Even today, I've never seen one doing that. It's always the black people. The white people are the ones who are privileged enough to be in the position of power and actually, standing in the shade and watching over what they're doing, supervising everything.
Okay,
So
so
yeah,
according
that's
to
my
you, who do you think has the power in this picture?
in this
Anybody, well,
picture.
anyone
It's
can
the
answer.
The white
Yeah.
person.
well,
Yeah, the white
Okay,
person
now
has
we
power.
have voices. Like the white person. Okay, yes, no, absolutely, right? The reason why
mm,
you say that is because I spoke to the idea that it's done in 1947. So automatically your mind tells you it's the time during apartheid, which automatically tells you the white person has power, right? But when we look
yes,
at it in today's society, we're actually looking at, first of all, this white guy has got this color which basically blends with the background, speaking to ideas of land, right? But look at the
mm-hmm,
guys, they are more dominant. They are the ones who
yes,
are bigger actually than
the
the
guy,
bus. I would actually, can we,
yes,
for yeah, just to be particular, which is more, they are more particular than the bus. Now
mm,
they even have, if you look at well, it's not really a weapon, but the tools that they're using for gardening, right?
mm,
If it was looked
mm,
at in today's content, you would actually assume that they are the ones who have more power than the bus that is actually seated at the background. So when one really thinks about power, yes, content is important, yes, time is important, but it's also really about how one perceives and views this from a particular eye, and where you are
mm,
as a person, as a person, as an individual. Ne?
mm,
Do
mm-hmm.
you understand? Do we
Yeah,
understand, Jeff?
I I'm so excited to be speaking to you because I know there's a very limited amount of time, so I decided to jump straight in. So my name is Anzio Jacobs. I am the director of an organization called Scope, Scope Facilitation, and our work is interested in kind of issues of power, privilege, and oppression, specifically when it comes to rural and peri-urban spaces. My kind of passion around these three thematic areas in the conversation in particular is largely informed by my activism during the time of Fees Must Fall. I was engaged in Fees Must Fall at WITS and was really kind of impassioned by the call for free education, myself having been financially excluded from the institution. It took me a number of years to get to the point of doing my master's degree. And in that time, I just kept on thinking about the fact that many people within my own family unit who are from all racial backgrounds, from different linguistic backgrounds, etc., were not experiencing the protests and were not having the same social experiences as what I was. And so this became a central part of my praxis and why it was that I kind of started to really delve into the type of work that I do. Yeah, I hope that that's enough. If you'd like me to say more, I'm happy to do so. I'm mindful of the time. Okay, and then in terms of the last one, oppression is something that, interestingly, in the context of power and privilege, is often negated because people in spaces of power and those that enjoy privilege do not want to see oppression because it stands in contrast to the power and privilege that is being experienced. And so I'm hoping that if we use that as a framework just to enter the discussion, we can start to kind of pick at certain elements that I hope will be useful to our engagement today. On the one, I'd like us to think about the social climate that we find ourselves in. The COVID-19 pandemic is something that I don't think anybody foresaw, but what it has done in a very short space of time is to really show up oppression in ways that I don't think it was previously possible. What I haven't mentioned is that in my own research, I'm interested in these topics, and I'm actively pursuing the topic of Feast Must Fall and thinking about the dynamics that played out between students. And so kind of segueing from there into the issue of oppression and COVID, I'd really like us to spend some time thinking about the fact that COVID-19 is illustrating the fact that we are in an economy that is built unjustly. The capitalist model is not one that was meant for equality. It was not designed in that way. And even just in relation to the image that we saw, historically, labor was black and labor was less than. Capitalist system was built on an understanding that only a few could benefit financially from the labor and exploitation of others. And I think that when we started to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, what that did was that it made that very apparent within the South African context. It showed us that if power is exposed in particular ways, you'll then give rise to a dialogue or conversation around oppression, which we can see in instances where gender-based violence is something that is being brought to the fore in a very particular way. We can see that in terms of the economy, we've got the haves and the have-nots in the South African context. And when we speak about power, privilege, and oppression in terms of those that have access to, and we think about those that are secluded from the system, we see it in things like job losses. I mean, the majority of people who have lost their jobs over the time of the COVID-19 pandemic are largely women bodies, largely Black people in the South African context who make up the majority of South Africa, and yet the income, the job security, the privilege that is experienced in the South African context is only held by a few, who are largely those that do not fall into those categories that were previously oppressed. I'd also like us to think about this in relation to time and space and place. These three operate simultaneously, but do different things. So when we think about time, we can think about a difference in the way a pandemic such as COVID-19 would have affected people during the Black Plague. And you then look at 2020 and you see how it's affecting people now and the resources that are available around that time. And then when you think of space, if you think of the space that South Africa is in as a country where there is huge racial discrepancies, or there are huge racial discrepancies between people, where we are trying to have racialized conversations that are rooted in systems such as capitalism. So when we talk about race, it is impossible to start to speak about race without speaking about land, without speaking about money, without speaking about access. And then finally, when we talk about place, South Africa operates in a very particular context, one that is informed by an apartheid legacy. And we're in a country where, because of the Group Areas Act of Apartheid, the country has been divided in particular ways that keep people in specific places.
Yeah.
I think I can jump in there. Gerald, I think that there's something interesting about looking at an apartheid context or an apartheid history that subjugated Black people. And then fast forward into 2020, where Black people are still subjugated, but you've got Black people that enjoy different degrees of privilege, right? So now you can have a Black upper class, you can have a Black middle class and a Black working class, but these are Black people experiencing different instances of privilege because of proximity to power. And so I think when Puleng is talking about shifting power, we're talking about the shift, as I mentioned earlier on, in terms of time, space, and place, which I think would be useful in this conversation. Every time we think about power and privilege, we've got to think about time. Where is that power and privilege occurring? We've got to think about space. What is the context which that power and privilege is occurring in? And we've got to think of place. What is the physical location of that power and privilege? And so to give you a very easy kind of example, in 2020, we imagine that because South Africa has been so long out of the apartheid era, that we were promised equality in our country and we are striving towards equality, that everybody would be on equal footing. But if we just look at the difference between Sandton and Alex, I'm sure for many of you, you've seen the image that is taken from a drone or whatever, where you see the divide between rich and poor. That does something very specific. Previously, it would have probably invoked the difference between black and white in South Africa. But the reality at present is that there are black people in Sandton and there are black people in Alex. There's quite a high likelihood that you would not find white people in Alex. But the difference is that there's a shift between the power and privilege.
But to just go through two stuff I noted I liked the statement you made when you said we can't in South Africa we can't compare apples to apples. I wish that could be said in this current situation to our leaders, because they're taking looking at other countries and what they've done, and they're trying to implement it in South Africa. But South Africa, unfortunately, is not the same as the other countries. We've got more issues, like when you were mentioning the Alex and Sandton situation. We've got the rural areas where when you look at schools, you can't compare, not even going to a multiracial school and the village school, just going to a township school and the village school, those sort of comparisons. And it puts that the privilege is in so many levels in our country, that it even makes this situation and coming up with new rules and how we move forward difficult, because I think as a government, they're not looking at those things. And then quickly, just the next point that you were asking, you mentioned something as why Black women are often sexualized and oppressed, etc. I think that goes into our home situation and our cultural situation, because from ekhaya sikhuliswa nendobana endlini indoda yenza so, intombazana yenza so, and to the point where even now, okay, now I've got kids, but in my 30s, before I reached my 30s, it's not about get an education, get a career, and build for yourself. It's uzalanini, because as a woman, your body is supposed to be incubator when producer. And to the thing of, if a man is more emotional, it's I want to buy morphe. What does morphe being equated to? You acting like a female as per se. So female is a weaker sex. So I think if we cause that disruption already culturally at home, where we try and eradicate and speak against the different sections and boxes that were already culturally being put in, it might, I don't know, it's going to take a while, but I think it starts there. It starts looking at that cultural stance in our families and in our cultures, and then we move forward to that.
Thank you so much for that input. I think it Lendo as a Makaya, where you've got to be woman first before you are anything else. And yet here in this South African context, it is Black women who are most oppressed in this economic kind of system, who are supposed to be running the household, bringing home the bacon, getting an education, rearing children, making sure that the household is sustained. And I think that without calling this a gendered issue, we must bring up gender, because gender-based violence extends beyond the physical, the emotional, the verbal assault that happen. It is a systemic assault on Black women bodies within the South African context, which we cannot ignore. Why is it that when we have job losses, women are adversely affected by those job losses? Why are 2/3 of the job losses Black women? How it makes no sense. If we think, yes, the same page, so they've got these little golf cart things that people are supposed to be taken to hospitals in. And I was reading the news where I think she's the MEC for Health in the Eastern Cape had equated the failure of this system to apartheid. And I thought that this was such an interesting comment to make, that the transportation system is failing because of apartheid. And I had to sit and just digest for a moment, because when I heard that comment and when I read it, I started to think about the fact that we have negated so many times to address the inequalities of the past, that when those inequalities are showing up in our present, we read them with the same lens as if they are occurring in the past. Remember, time, space, place, right? So when you've got the MEC equating the breakdown in the transport system to apartheid, I think we should also read a bit closer, dig a little deeper. What is she saying? There's a huge problem in the Eastern Cape. There's a huge problem in the Eastern Cape because perhaps leadership is undermined in a particular way. To have an MEC for Health in the Eastern Cape, in an area that is extremely traditional, that goes by cultural practice, that sees women in a particular way, may be doing something in that context. And so I thought that that's also another interesting linkage, right? How much of what she's saying can be attributed to the past, and how much of that is playing out in real time now that we can't see because we've been so conditioned to our past realities that those things are not visible to us. There's some questions, but I'm trying to read and speak back. Maybe Jane, you could help out there.
Yeah, so here, the demonstration that Anzio did with the paper reminds me of somebody I know. She was doing research about race hierarchy. I assume it was performance ethnography. Black, better black, white, better white. So, and I thought of how even in our similarities, we still have dynamics that make us different. To kind of speak to that hierarchy.
So, I mean, that hierarchy is such an interesting thing, because even if we take it and we put it in today's kind of, if we put it in current context, we can think about something as simple as this term that gets flung around often, yeah, yellow bone. You know, if you are in the dating scene in South Africa as a Black woman, the preference is for a yellow bone, but that preference does not come from nowhere. It is not a preference that is without history. That preference is informed by the proximity in terms of skin color to whiteness that is playing out in our current context in a very particular way, because even the imagery that we see in the kind of media space broadly, when you see Black South African women celebrities that are given preference and airtime, they are yellow bone. You will seldom see a dark-skinned woman taking preference in our media landscape, because that's not what we have been taught is beautiful. But if we go a step deeper than that, when we teach our children how to color pictures in, we don't give them that option, right? You'll have umdomnyama, black, where the black or the very dark brown crayon must be used, and a white person, umlungu, who would be painted in a yellow or pink. And we don't teach that the Black person is equally as beautiful as the white person in these images, because we first need to teach the difference between race. And when we teach that difference between race, we teach it as we've been taught it, which is a very dangerous thing, because we perpetuate the very system that we seek to disrupt. I think the performance ethnography is something really cool. Nhlanhla had a point.
So I think there's a comment on gender-based violence to note. And then moving into this next comment is really important. For one, I think it's because our leaders that are stereotypes, they don't want change. All they focus on is power, and the results are greedy. When I say leaders, I don't only mean politicians, even traditional leaders, and even our parents, which is very, very important.
Mm. In the South African education system, if you look at teachers that are from the generation that was subject to Bantu education, they're coming into an educational system that has been reformed several times over, and they are teaching kids that did not exist in the same time, space, and place as what they did. And this is the educator that, by no fault of their own, has to teach a child that is existing in a space where we've got to say something like Black Lives Matter, where we've got to distinguish between yellow bone and a dark skinned person. This is the same teacher that has to make distinctions between toxic masculinity and masculinity. You know, these are the same teachers that need to navigate SOGI SC, like you learned in your previous session, where you've got to make a distinction between sexual orientation and gender identity. And it's a very big and unfair ask when you're asking people who were never given the tools to educate a young South Africa in a particular way to go and do this work, when many of the times they themselves are unsure about these topics entail. Within the South African context, gender-based violence is a really interesting phenomenon. And it's so because gender-based violence, again, is informed by a history that we cannot ignore if we want to tackle gender-based violence. So for those of you who can get your hands on the book, I strongly recommend that you do. Prof. Pumla Tola wrote a book called Rape, the South African Nightmare, or A South African Nightmare. And there's a portion in the book, I want to venture and say it was around chapter 13, where she speaks about the history of slavery and how women slaves became sexualized within the colony. And that sexualization of women slaves informed by an economy of bodies, an economy of reproduction, an economy of subjugation. And when we think about those economies, we cannot separate that discussion from the discussion of capitalism. So if we go back in the history of capitalism, you'll know that capitalism has one primary function, and it is to produce labor, because that labor is what is going to result in capital. And so interestingly, in the history of capitalism, you'll notice that when capitalism comes up in history, it comes up at the same time as the witch trials in history. And that's a really interesting thing, because capitalism was linked to the church. And I'm not calling out Christians, I'm not trying to go into a religious debate, but capitalism was linked to the church, and the church having to exert power at a specific time in our history. And that power was exerted through taking control of women's bodies, which are the source of production and labor. So if you could control a woman's body at that point, you could control the means of production and the means of labor. So what was done was that women who did not pay attention to what men were saying, women who did not want to marry, women who did not want to have children, they were framed as witches, because you could burn a witch at the stake, and that would tell other women that if they did not obey, they would be put to death. And so this is the history that informs capitalism, that ultimately informs slavery, and then slavery and the Black woman's body becomes the immediate site on which to build capital. So if you over-sexualize the Black woman's body, you've got the Black woman herself does not have agency. And if she does not have agency, she will keep reproducing in the system without question, which will produce the labor that will go and work the fields, that will go and tend to the kitchens, that will produce more slaves, that will feed you, that will feed your children, that will not go questioned at any point in time, because that Black woman's body has been generated as a commodity of slavery. And so we cannot talk about the two without seeing that history, because that is the very same history that informs gender-based violence. That's the very same history that tells men that women's bodies are commodities and accessible. That is the same history that informs the fact that women's bodies are so easily kind of pushed over. Women's bodies are so easily dismissed. women's bodies are so easily replaceable. That's why you can have Uyinene walking into a post office and being killed, because a woman's body is part of a system where another one can be generated very quickly. A woman's body is just a means of production. And devaluing women's bodies in a particular way cannot be divorced from a conversation on race. It cannot be divorced from a conversation on power. We cannot talk about a Black woman's body without talking about patriarchy and oppression. We cannot talk about a Black woman's body without talking about the commodification of a Black woman's body that allows a Black man, or man for that matter, to wolf whistle. We cannot talk about it without rape. We cannot talk about it without those levels of subjugation, because those levels of subjugation are what are informing the access that men want to have to women's bodies.
Okay.
If
No, please do.
If I can jump in from a facilitation point of view, I often have to have dialogues around race. It's a huge part of the work that I'm currently doing. And in those conversations on race, especially in corporate space, I find that men often talk more than women. And when conversations come up about race, white people tend to talk more than Black people. And so what I've had to do is build a praxis that is very much aware of that. So when I come into spaces such as that, I think ground rules in terms of engagement are really important. I think that when you are facilitating a space, it is useful to have at least one or two components of your facilitation practice that ask everybody to speak. And if that can be towards the beginning, the middle, and the end of the conversation, even if you've got some people that are speaking slightly more than others, you're more likely to get a diverse kind of perspective in terms of those that are in the room. And if I can just give you one or two ideas, something that I like to do at the beginning of workshops is do a temperature check. I usually do it with colors. It doesn't have to be colors, where the colors will tell you people's moods in the room. So if you ask people to describe their mood in a color, and if those colors are darker, generally that means that a person's not in a good space. And if they lighter, the opposite. Again, we can see with this color example, it is very nuanced and it has a history to it, but it does give you a sense of who is where in the room. Another way to do that is to ensure that when you ask people to answer, that if you have made a point about someone answering in 1 or 2 words, that you do not leave the participant that answers in 10 sentences and then skip over the following person that just answered in 1 word. Because what you'll find is that usually those that have power and privilege in the space are likely to talk more and take up more time. And if you as the facilitator are not pointing that out as a problem, it becomes part of the ethos of your facilitation and workshop. And then finally, just in closing, to be sure that those that haven't spoken a lot in the session are the ones that you call to give closing comments. Because you'll often find that those that are sitting quiet perhaps have a lot to say, but need the time to digest what they've been what's been spoken through and how the information has been presented. And by the time it comes to the end of the workshop, they're more likely to give a nuanced answer with many facets to the conversation considered already. So just a few tips.
There's a lovely list of comments. I think especially starting off with Melissa saying that it makes us more conscious as facilitators. So really thinking of your own role and your own positionality as a facilitator. And then there's a beautiful quote here at the end from Gerard. The social instinct of a skilled facilitator can bring out the best qualities of individuals in a group. It's a rather long, very lovely quote. Please take a look at it. And also at the end here, there's a text that I think everybody can look at. It's really pertinent to facilitation. But looking at that and thinking through the fact that facilitation also comes from a human place. We're all people and people make mistakes, okay? We essentially also have to know that if you're working with a group of young people and you're talking about sensitive topics like this, that you never want to be imposing any viewpoints onto other people. So Anzio has given a list of nice little tools that you can use that really do help to set the tone of a space and also to get a feel for the room and to think about also what your experiences are as a facilitator. I think this leads us really nicely into the power flower. What do you bring into the room when you are leading a conversation with a group of young people? Because they're looking at you as the guider, as the leader, and as the facilitator. You hold that power as well. So what do you bring into a space? What personal experiences inform your facilitation? They're always very important point to say that the personal is political, and I think at this point this is a very pertinent statement in the world. And to think about your own style as a facilitator, and to think of your own methods that you choose to use. And as creative people who engage with applied drama exercises, you often will find that there are lots of exercises that you can do with young people that will avoid singling anybody out, or avoid a kind of a imbalanced power dynamic in a group. But I think we can maybe, if you would help me out, Anzio, to look at the power flower image, if you don't mind sharing it on your side, thanks. If we can look at the power flower image, before we have final comments, I think it's nice to just look at the model. And what the power flower does is it allows us to think about power as it is relational, and how it relates to us in the world, okay? So each petal will represent a dimension of diversity, which is on this flower. You can see race, gender, sexuality, class, mental health. When I talk about ability in this flower, please note that it's got to do with whether or not you have a disability, okay? It doesn't talk about how strong you are. It talks about whether or not you have a psychological, mental, or physical disability, and then nationality, which is a very important petal in this country. Think about this in relation to the work that you do. I really think it's an important exercise to do with young people, and you can facilitate it with a group. But what we're going to be asking of you is to each do this exercise at home. So you'd be drawing the flower and you'd be following the steps. You'll see that there's 3 steps that you can follow, and basically a written reflection. Okay, so before I allow for final comments, I just also want to say how impressed I was by the incredible reflections that you've already submitted in relation to the SOGI SC talk. It's really amazing to see the growth and the learning and the understanding. So this is a little bit more creative. We want you to have fun with this, enjoy drawing the flower, enjoy reflecting on the exercise. Look at the petals, think about areas where you do have power and areas where you do not have power. There might be petals that you have more power and some that you have less. Feel free to color it in and decorate it how you like. And what we would like you to do is reflect on the exercise in a paragraph. So talk about what the exercise means to you. You're encouraged to use your own language. You don't have to write in English. And really to kind of reflect on what this exercise could mean for you in a classroom or in a space when you're working with young people. It allows us to think and to name certain things in society that we might not necessarily have noticed before. So yeah, please have fun with the exercise. I'll follow up with you around that. But if there are any questions regarding how the power flower works, and maybe there's some confusion around it, now would be a good time to ask a bit about it.
Okay.
Does everybody kind of get how the exercise works?
No.
No, okay. No.
So, Genevieve, do you mind if I explain?
Please. Yeah.
Okay, so can you guys see the screen, right, of the power flower?
Sure.
So the big one is, the big and the small together is basically one petal. And the small part is where you have power, and the bigger part, which is the outside, is where you don't have power. And if you can see in each section, you've got race, gender, sexuality, etc. So for instance, if I look at my gender, I have to decide as an individual, as Puleng, where do I have power? And if I feel I have power when it comes to gender, I will definitely color in the smaller parts. If I feel like I don't have power as in gender as a South African woman, let's say, I will color out the outside of that petal.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Okay.
I've done one here which may help. I think
And
that is,
sometimes and sometimes you feel like, okay, I feel like I have power, but I also feel like I don't have power. You can also color half and half, or be creative with how you feel. It really is an individual project, an individual participation. And yeah, sorry, Enzio, you were saying?
no, I was just saying that I've done one here, so people can see kind of just how the flower can be colored in. It doesn't need to be just in one part or the other. It can be in between both, depending on what your experience is.
Great. So the nice thing about this exercise is when you do the flower, you draw it in front of a group of people. Let's imagine you have your class with you and you draw this on the board and you ask everybody to draw their own flower and to color in their various different petals to show where they do have power and where they don't have power. You would often sit in a circle and you would allow people to pick one petal and to talk about that petal and to explain why they feel they have power in that petal or why they feel they do not have power in that petal. The fun part of this exercise is after you've had that discussion, you throw it into the room and you say, now imagine one of those petals was reversed. Imagine for one moment that you had power somewhere where you did not have power before. How will your life be different? And I think that's a really nice springboard for dialogue with young people because it allows for the imagination to come in, but also it makes us think about the world that we live in and to imagine, oh my word, what would it be like if I did have the same power in the gender petal as somebody who is at the top of the food chain in that sense. So it's an exercise to make us think about how power relates to us and how we relate to various different aspects of society. Great. So that's the exercise we would like you to do for your reflection. Remember that it will also be accompanied with a paragraph, just a short paragraph where you reflect on what it felt like to do this exercise and what it made you think about. Cool. Now, are there any final kind of comments? I see that we've got another, yep.
We are confused here with them of this studying the power flower thing. Can you please just repeat that first? Like, how does it work?
So can we share the image one last time and then we look at it again? Right, so you've got a flower and it has some of these petals will be named. You can choose how you want to name them, but basically you're going to copy this flower on a piece of paper. You'll have an outside petal, which is, you can see on this flower, the outside petal, which says class. Underneath it, it says, I don't have power. That's the outside petal. Then you will see there are inside small petals on the inside of the flower. That's where you indicate that you don't have power in that certain category. So for example, on this flower, the class is colored in, which means the person who would have drawn this flower does not feel like they have power in class. But in ability, this person has power because they've indicated that they've colored in the inside little petal. Do you want to look at Anzio's flower one more, this beautiful artwork that Anzio did?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, so cool. So you can be very creative. You can draw your flower however you want to. Can we mute? Thanks. You can draw your flower however you want to. You can draw it with a stick in the sand and take a picture of it if you want to. You can paint it if you want to. You can decide how you want to draw it. It's really up to you. And then to write a short paragraph about what the exercise means to you and how you reflected on one of the petals, for example. It's for you to learn a new exercise that you can use with the young people that you work with. Puleng, do you think that we are good with the flower? Maybe explain
Yeah.
a bit more?
Do you want me to put it up again, or you want more explanation? I think what we can do, I mean, I think everybody has the image.
Yeah.
And just to kind of see what the steps are. And if anyone has like serious and they're really struggling in terms of how to reflect, I think part of this reflection, Genevieve, should also entail, I think you mentioned the narrative. So why are you saying you have power here, or why are you saying you do not have power there? Yeah, we are here for you. Witumelo is also a good communicator when it comes to kind of unpacking or trying to explain how we can assist.
Yeah. Great. So if there are any more questions on the flower, can we put it on the WhatsApp group? And just to round off a little bit, to give Anzio the last moment to hold, I would like to there's a final comment here that speaks to listening and engaging. And I'm just going to read a little bit of it. It says, it's best to just listen sometimes. Engaging effectively is indeed important, but I've learned that there are other topics that I ought to just remain a listener throughout. So I'm just picking up on that little part, and to kind of speak about how going forward, what, power, privilege, and oppression teaches us as well is how sometimes we speak on behalf of other people. And as a white person, hello, we are the worst. We do this all the time, and we're the worst listeners. And the reason for this being is because of a specific space that is occupied by somebody who holds that privilege and that power. So perhaps talking about active listening in the classroom when we are talking about these difficult subjects, or also just active listening with one another in order to really, understand these concepts. Sorry, I don't know if I'm making any sense.
So I think just kind of in closing, Lulo, thank you so much. That was such a great comment. And I think it helps us really think about how it is that we should watch ourselves when we facilitate. Active listening is actually paying attention to what someone is saying. We've got this habit in our conversations and in daily life to, when you get excited, when someone is saying something that resonates with you, or that you're feeling, someone says something that you really like, and then you start to speak with them or over them. And this is a common mistake, because it cuts someone off. It cuts off the chain of thought. It stops them from saying what they need to say. And is a mistake that we make because we do it in our everyday conversations. So active listening is the skill that we can develop as facilitators, where you make sure that you don't speak until someone else has finished what they are saying. And that is a very useful tool to have in your practice, because sometimes you get someone that's busy saying something, and while they are saying it, in the middle of what they are saying, they pause. And usually that pause, they'll say, and at those times, sometimes as facilitators, we jump in and we start the next thought. But what that often means is that that person is still processing what it is that they're about to say, or trying to finish off the thought that they had. And when we interject or jump in between, we run the risk of losing very important engagement in that conversation. That may mean that you've kind of cut someone off in the middle of a thought. And because they aren't able to fully process that thought, when you move on, it seems like you're not listening to them at all. So you may be responding to something that this person was perhaps still going to finish their thought. And what that does is that it makes them feel as if your entire facilitation is very egocentric. It's about you and what you are saying, and not about them and what they are saying. And that type of practice in facilitation, we often trip up in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of sexual orientation. Those are three kind of key spaces. If I make a very practical example of this, again, using fees must fall as an example, we were talking about free education for those who did not have access and money to get to education. But if you looked at the fees must fall cohort, many of the people that appeared on camera, many of the people that were speaking, were middle to upper class people that could afford the education that they were talking about. And those that were from the working class that needed to be present and needed to have their voices heard were not there in that conversation at all. And so that's a very practical way of thinking about the things that we need to guard against. We need to watch in spaces like with the power flower, where our privilege lies, where our power lies, and to make sure that that power and privilege does not go into the space of facilitation and affect those that we are trying to facilitate with and for.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your contribution, Enzio. It's been really, really rich conversation. It's always a pleasure to facilitate with you. And I just wanted to note, or before we carry on, I think they want to, if you could type maybe in the chat box some reading material. There's a follow-up asking on Prof. Pumela's book, the title of that again. But so Enzio is gonna share some reading material with everybody in the chat box, and thank you so much again. Just to kind of take a moment to note that we're finding ourselves in a very stressful time, and as the coordinators of this program, we are very aware that you are going through various different challenges as a group. And we want to, let you know that the next session that we're going to be having in August is going to be completely focused on mental health. We're going to be looking at coping mechanisms. This also is very important in relation to facilitation, because you're going to realize that when you work with people, you often will take on a lot of trauma from other people who come to you with their own problems, and you might not also feel equipped to necessarily handle all of the problems that you will have that come up when you facilitate with a group of people. So as facilitators, we know what that is like, and we have to understand that secondary trauma is a real thing. And then secondly, we know that we are in a pandemic. We know that people are struggling for various different reasons. And we are going to be facilitating a session next time on the 14th of August with a psychologist who's also a facilitator around coping mechanisms and thinking through mental health during this time. So we really much look forward to holding that space with you next time. And what I'm going to do now is just share with you, before we have any burning final comments, the Lifeline contact details. I'm going to put it in the chat box. It's a national number that you can call that is a phone counseling service. So Lifeline is a very, very good resource during this time. And if they are not able to help you, they will be able to refer you if you are in need of any counseling, or if you know of anybody who is in need of any counseling. So I'm going to share that number with you here. All right, Puleng.
Yeah, so Genevieve, I just quickly came into the office because I wanted to kind of, for the last time, try to explain the power flower.
Nice.
Okay, yeah, now I see it. Okay, so this is basically what the power flower is like, or aims to be like. So I'm not sure if you can see, I did the small petals, and then right on top of that, I did the bigger petals. And then this is gender, race, blah, 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 blah. And then this is where I feel I do not have power when it comes to my gender. But this is where I feel, this is just an example. This is where
the other way around.
this is where I feel I have power in my gender. And this is where I feel I do not have power when it comes to race. This is just an example. And then just here at the bottom, when you have your reflection, so you're like, okay, I feel I have less power in my gender because, or I feel I have less power in my race because, you know, I see that the questions are coming in even in my private WhatsApp. So I just thought I should clarify it as I do it myself physically here in the office.
Thank you so much.
I hope it helps somehow.
No, are there any more questions regarding the talk or the flower or anything?
If not, I'd like to close by actually just quickly speaking to the competition. And I think Genevieve, you can help us here. You can help me here. So I'm sure you guys have heard about the competition. Boitumelo graciously kind of sent us the information where, of course, we are during this time, we have schools that do not have some sanitizing material. And what we're doing is just, if you guys can attend some of these sessions, reflect, give back as much as you can. And right at the end, we will kind of see who has the three who have really given back, and we use that to, oh sorry, I also have a little baby in the room. And we also use that to Musa. We then use that to give back to the schools. So yeah, I may not have explained it properly, but I know Boitumelo did a splendid job explaining it during the WhatsApp group. So we really look forward to seeing more of you and participating in this. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you so much to Anzio for the very, very important input and for a really rich conversation. Thank you to everybody who participated. Thanks, Peleng, for the beautiful tour of the Javid Art Center. I do look forward to seeing the second level next time. That would be really nice. And also for all of your inputs. Please do stay safe during this time, and know that we are available on the WhatsApp group for you to ask any questions or to talk to. I don't know if it's okay for me, Anzio, just to direct people to the Scope website. I don't know if you can just put a link in the chat, but if you are interested in the work that Scope is doing and the facilitation methodology that we engage with as well, please do take a look at our website, and you can also find some really nice resources there that will be of interest to you, I'm sure. And also know that if you need to contact either myself or Peleng or even Anzio, you will be able to find contacts on the Scope website as well. We really wish you all the best for all your endeavors during this time. I know that it's not an easy time to be doing any kind of studies or any kind of emotionally and physically and mentally draining work. We hope that you have fun with the reflection exercise and with the power flower, and think about ways that you could also maybe incorporate it into your own facilitation. But thank you so much and stay safe, guys. Anzio, do you want to say bye?
Hi, everyone. I just remembered a really cool line, which was, to celebrate Black bodies does not mean to negate white ones. And I thought that's something cool just to think about. To celebrate our own existences and to celebrate ourselves doesn't mean that we stop celebrating other people.
Lovely. Thank you so much. And